أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين. Assalamu alaikum, dear brothers and sisters, wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and I'd like to welcome you to another episode of the life of Prophet Muhammad. We mentioned in our previous episodes that with the death of Abu Talib, the Prophet had lost his political protection. Abu Talib was the chief of Quraysh, and as long as Abu Talib was present, no one dared to inflict any harm on the Prophet. After the death of Abu Talib, the Prophet, as we discussed, he sought what we can call political asylum from the various tribes in Arabia, especially in Mecca and the surrounding areas. He tried to emigrate to Ta'if. He tried to invite some of the tribes of Ta'if to Islam, but all of those attempts unfortunately were unsuccessful. Now the Prophet ﷺ finds himself not knowing where aid is going to come from. The future of Islam looks very grim at this juncture. So this is all happening in Mecca. Meanwhile, in the city of Yathrib, which is the ancient name for the city of Medina, the Aus and the Khazraj, as we discussed, the two main tribes, the two main Arab tribes in Yathrib were the Aus and Khazraj, and they were rivals. They were powerful tribes who were constantly fighting one another, and they were involved in, they have a long standing history of civil war. The Battle of Bu'ath, as historians mention, the Battle of Bu'ath was the fourth and the latest clash between the Aus and the Khazraj. So they were always involved in skirmishes, in small-scale military conflicts. But in the past, there were three major wars between the Aus and the Khazraj, and the Battle of Bu'ath, or Bughath, according to some reports, was the fourth and last major war between the Aus and the Khazraj. And this war really destroyed the community in Yathrib. It caused, it was a very divisive time. The war polarized the community. There was a lot of bitterness between the tribes. And the situation in Yathrib became so unbearable that the moderate clansmen from both sides, from the Aus and the Khazraj, they proposed that we need to elect a leader, a single leader who will unify us all. So what they do is they decide to appoint Abdullah ibn Ubay, who was the chief of Khazraj, and the reason why he was looked to for this position is because even though he was a chief of the Khazraj, he refused to fight with his clansmen against the Aus on the grounds that this was an unjust war. There was no justification for it. So when the war quelled between the two sides, they saw Abdullah ibn Ubay ibn Salul as someone who was fair, someone who could be impartial, and therefore, at least temporarily, they appointed him as the ruler of Yathrib. Now, this is important because when the Prophet goes on the Hijrah, when eventually the Prophet arrives in Medina, who loses his political power? Abdullah ibn Ubay. And later on in the seerah, we will see that this man becomes one of the most prominent hypocrites in the community of the Prophet. And it goes back to the fact that he was the ruler of Medina, he was the ruler of Yathrib, until the Prophet arrived and he basically lost all of his power and his influence. According to a narration in Ibn Sa'ad's seerah, and if you want more information about the seerah of Ibn Sa'ad, you can refer to episode 1 where we speak about some of the primary sources for the seerah. In any case, according to the narration of Ibn Sa'ad, when the conflict between the Aus and the Khazraj reached its peak, when the violence became intense, there were two men who decided to travel to Mecca to seek help from Quraysh against the Aus. These two men are important. The first of them is As'ad ibn Zurara and Dhakwan. These are two men from the tribe of Khazraj. They travel, they leave Yathrib, they come to Medina to solicit help from Quraysh so they can vanquish the tribe of Aus. Now, when does this happen? So the battle of Bu'ath, it lasted for a number of years, and the fighting was so intense that historians say that even at night the men carried their weapons, meaning they would attack each other during the day, during the night. So the situation became unbearable in Yathrib. So these two men, As'ad ibn Zurara and Dhakwan, they decide to make the trip to Mecca. Now this trip to Mecca took place sometime between the 5th year after the Bi'tha and the 10th year after the Bi'tha. And this is an important time period in Mecca because this is when the Prophet and Bani Hashim were under sanctions. This was the time of the blockade. So As'ad ibn Zurara and Dhakwan, they arrive in Mecca. They run into Utbah ibn Rabi'a. Utbah ibn Rabi'a is basically the father of Hind, the father-in-law of Abu Sufyan, one of the most prominent figures in Meccan society, a man of great wealth, of great influence. So they put their request to him. They basically ask him, they appeal to him for support, for military support. Utbah ibn Rabi'a tells As'ad ibn Zurara and Dhakwan that, listen, our city is distant from yours. Yathrib is far away, and we have troubles that won't allow us to engage in any other. Utbah ibn Rabi'a says that we have our own problems in Mecca right now, and we're not in any position to offer you help because we cannot spread ourselves thin. There is a problem that we are trying to tend to now in Mecca. So As'ad asks Utbah, what troubles could you possibly have, considering that, this is Mecca, this is the Haram, this is the sanctuary of peace. The pagans recognized that this is a sacred place. What possible issues could you be having? Utbah says to him that a man from among us has risen up claiming to be a messenger of God. He claims that he is connected to God, that he was appointed by God. And he says to As'ad that he has denounced our elders as fools. He wants us to abandon the customs and the traditions of our predecessors. He railed against our gods. He's corrupted our youth. And he's caused major rifts in our society. He's broken up families because of his message. So As'ad, he says, who is this man? Utbah says he is the son of Abdullah ibn Abdul Muttalib. And he comes from the most noble and prestigious clan within the Quraysh. So this is not just a nobody. This is someone who comes from the most noble clan, who comes from the most noble family. That's why it's causing us so much trouble. These are not the words of an outsider. He's one of us. And in fact, he is the best of us. As'ad and Dhakwan, again, remember, these two men are from the tribe of Khazraj. They're coming from Yathrib. They want some support from Quraysh. And they hear that there's this man in Mecca who's creating a lot of problems for Quraysh. So when they hear this from Utbah, it sparks their curiosity. They say that, we want to go meet, we want to see this man. And the reason why is because, As'ad ibn Zurara and Dhakwan, they're from Yathrib, and Yathrib, there was a significant Jewish diaspora in Yathrib. So they had heard from the Jews of prophecies. They've heard the prophecies of a prophet who would rise up in Mecca and who would emigrate to Yathrib. So they ask Utbah, where is this man? Utbah says that he is in the Hijr. He's in Hijr Ismail. He's next to the Kaaba. And if you remember, brothers and sisters, even though the Prophet was under a blockade and they were sanctioned and there was an embargo imposed upon them, Quraysh allowed them to leave the mountain hideout of Abu Talib during Hajj and Umrah. So the Prophet was free to roam about during Hajj. So Utbah says that he's in the Hijr. But Utbah told As'ad and Dhakwan that be careful. Don't approach him. Don't listen to him because he has enchanted many people with his spells. You may become affected by his sorcery. So As'ad, he sees the Prophet for the first time in the Hijr of Ismail, and he decides to talk to him. And he basically asks him, what is your message? Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alayhi, he says, my message is that there is no God but Allah and Muhammad, and I am his messenger, and I call you to the following. Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alayhi, he recites 2 verses from Surah Al-An'am, Surah 6, verses 151 and 152. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. قُلْ تَعَالَوْا أَتْلُ مَا حَرَّمَ رَبُّكُمْ عَلَيْكُمْ. Tell them, O Muhammad, come, and I shall recount what your Lord has forbidden for you. أَلَّا تُشْرِكُوا بِهِ شَيْئًا, that you shall not ascribe any partners to him. وَبِالْوَالِدَيْنِ إِحْسَانًا, and that you be good to your parents. وَلَا تَقْتُلُوا أَوْلَادَكُم مِّنْ إِمْلَاقٍ نَحْنُ نَرْزُقُكُمْ وَإِيَّاهُمْ, and that you not kill your children due to poverty. Abortion because of poverty was very common in Arabia. Don't kill your children due to poverty. We shall provide for you and for them. وَلَا تَقْرَبُوا الْفَوَاحِشَ مَا ظَهَرَ مِنْهَا وَمَا بَطَنَ, and do not approach indecencies, whether public or private. وَلَا تَقْتُلُوا النَّفْسَ الَّتِي حَرَّمَ اللَّهُ إِلَّا بِالْحَقِّ, and that you do not kill a soul whose life has been made inviolable except with due cause. This is what he has enjoined upon you so that you may use your intellect. And then the Prophet says, وَلَا تَقْرَبُوا, he says, وَلَا تَقْرَبُوا مَالَ الْيَتِيمِ إِلَّا بِالَّتِي هِيَ أَحْسَنُ, and do not approach the orphan's property. Of course, especially in Yathrib and all over Arabia, because of the wars and the conflict, there were many widows and many orphans. So you see the emphasis of this Quranic injunction: do not approach the orphan's property. Do not misappropriate the money of orphans, except in the best possible manner until he comes of age. حتى يبلغ أشده وأوفوا الكيل والميزان بالقسط, and observe fully the measure and the balance with fairness, meaning observe fairness in your economic transactions. Don't cheat people. لا نكلف نفسا إلا وسعها. We task no soul except according to its capacity. وَإِذَا قُلْتُمْ فَاعْدِلُوا وَلَوْ كَانَ ذَا قُرْبَى وَبِعَهْدِ اللَّهِ أَوْفُوا. And when you speak, be fair, even if it is against a relative. And this is important because in Arabia, your tribe was always right. Here the Quran says, speak fairly, speak justly, even if it is against a relative, even if it's against a clansman, and fulfill God's covenant. This is what He enjoins upon you, so that you may take admonition. So the Prophet recites these two verses to these men, these two men who come from Yathrib, who want to know what Islam is all about. He basically goes through the fundamental moral values of the religion. As'ad ibn Zurara, he listens to the Quran and he says the Shahada. It only took 2 verses of the Quran and a brief meeting with the Prophet. And of course, when Rasulullah recites Quran, when he explains the Quran, it's not like you and I when we try to, explain and present the Quran to others. The Prophet's words were very impactful. And As'ad, on the spot, he declares that there is no God but Allah and that Muhammad is his messenger. He becomes a Muslim. And he As'ad ibn Zurara, and I want you to memorize this name, he is the first convert to Islam from the people of Yathrib. And Dhakwan also converts. As'ad then says to the Prophet, O Messenger of God, I am from Yathrib, from the Khazraj tribe. Between us and our brethren, the Aus, our ties are broken. As we mentioned, constant warfare, and the battle of Bu'ath completely decimated any semblance of unity and brotherhood among them. As'ad then says to the Prophet, if God mends these ties through you, no one will be dearer to us than you. By God, we used to hear prophecies about you from the Jews. They used to give us tidings of your advent and reveal your description to us. So the Arabs of Yathrib, they were very well acquainted with Jewish scriptures. They knew about these prophecies. They used to give us glad tidings of your advent and reveal your description to us, he says. I hope that our city will be your destination and your new home. And then he says, praise is for God for guiding me to you. By God, we came to seek help in destroying our brethren, but God has given me something far better. As'ad says to the Prophet that I came to Mecca with the niyyah, with the intention of soliciting help from Quraysh so we can decimate the tribe of the Aus. But I'm glad that Allah guided me to you, and perhaps we can mend the hearts and repair the damages that we've done. So these two men, As'ad ibn Zurara and Dhakwan, they go back to Yathrib. And they spend, a couple of years, 2-3 years, and they're Muslims now, and they're secretly inviting the they secretly invite the Prophet, they invite the people of Yathrib to the religion of Islam. So there is a secret da'wah that takes place. So after a few years, 2 to 3 years, perhaps more, Islam spreads among the people of Yathrib. And it's all because of the efforts of As'ad ibn Zurara and Dhakwan. These two Muslims go back and they start privately inviting friends, relatives to Islam. In the 12th year after the Bi'tha, so this was a few years after their meeting with the Prophet, a delegation of 12 men from Medina, 10 from the tribe of Khazraj, 2 from the tribe of Aus, they come from Medina, they arrive in Mecca, and they meet with the Prophet at a hollow near Jamarat al-Akaba, which is in Mina. And they make a pledge to the Prophet. They gather around the Prophet. So they're Muslims, they converted to Islam. And they gather around the Prophet and they listen intently to his words. So 12 people from Medina who had converted, he says to them, the Prophet says to them, come here and pledge that you will not associate any with Allah. So either they had converted or they were inclined towards Islam. The Prophet speaks to them. He says that, come here and pledge that you will not associate any with Allah, that you will not steal, nor commit unlawful sexual intercourse, nor kill your children, nor utter slander intentionally forging falsehood, nor disobey me in any good. He who fulfills this, Allah will reward him. And he who neglects anything and is afflicted in this world, it may prove redemption for him in the hereafter. And if the sin remains hidden from the eyes of men, and no grief comes to him, then his affair is with Allah. He may forgive him or he may not. So the Prophet goes over, he gives this short speech to them, and this became known as the First Acaba Pledge, Bay'atul Aqabatil Ula. And as you saw, the summary of what the terms of the pledge were is that the Prophet basically asked them, commanded them not to associate partners with Allah, that they should not commit theft, they should not steal, they should not commit adultery or fornication, they should stop committing infanticide, whether it's burying female infants alive or aborting children because of fear of poverty. They should not falsely attribute paternity, that don't falsely ascribe children to people who are not their fathers, and not to disobey the Prophet in any good. The Prophet tells you to do something, you should obey. So they make the pledge to the Prophet, and they ask the Prophet ﷺ. Now, because As'ad and Dhakwan, they had met the Prophet briefly, and they just knew the basics of Islam. They asked the Prophet if he could send someone to Yathrib who could teach them the Quran, because Quran is being revealed where? It's being revealed in Mecca. And the Muslims who are in Yathrib, they have no access to revelation at this point. And they have no one there who is familiar with what has already been revealed. So they make this request to the Prophet that, Ya Rasulullah, we need someone to educate us. So the Prophet ﷺ, he sends Mus'ab ibn Umair. Mus'ab ibn Umair, and this was very wise of the Prophet. The Prophet knew that there were the Aus and the Khazraj were rivals. So he makes a good choice that he doesn't appoint someone from the Aus or someone from the Khazraj to be the Quran teacher for the community. Because if he appoints someone from the Khazraj, someone from the Aus tribe will feel slighted, and vice versa. So he appoints Mus'ab ibn Umair, who was native to Mecca. He was a Hashimi. He was not from the Aus and the Khazraj, and he was quite familiar with the Quran, especially the surahs that were revealed in Mecca. Now, what makes Mus'ab the main contender for this position, and what makes him the choice of the Prophet, is that he was one of the first people who converted to Islam. He converted to Islam when the Prophet was secretly inviting people to Islam in Darul Arqam. And the Prophet saw great sincerity in this man. Mus'ab he concealed his conversion to Islam even from his own parents and from his relatives. And he used to secretly meet the Prophet ﷺ. And Mus'ab ibn Umair, he hails from a very wealthy family. He was one of the most attractive young men in Meccan society. So he had the money, he had the looks. Women would, they would throw themselves at him. He had everything. And the Prophet ﷺ, he says, there's a narration that's attributed to the Prophet that says, إن رسول الله لما أقبل عليه مصعب بن عمير وعليه إهاب كبش. The Prophet ﷺ, one day he saw Mus'ab ibn Umair wearing some very coarse clothing, very simple clothing. And the Prophet, he said to his companions, انظروا إلى رجل قد نور الله قلبه. Look at a man, he's pointing at Mus'ab, look at a man whose heart has been illuminated by God. وَلَقَدْ رَأَيْتُهُ وَهُوَ بَيْنَ أَبَوَيْهِ يُغَذِّيَانِهِ بِأَطْيَبِ الْأَطْعِمَةِ وَأَلْيَنِ اللِّبَاسِ فَدَعَاهُ حُبُّ اللَّهِ وَرَسُولِهِ إِلَى مَا تَرَوْنَ. The Prophet says that before he became Muslim, before Mus'ab became Muslim, I used to see him in Mecca, and his parents used to feed him the best food. He used to wear the finest garments. He lived a life of luxury. And he abandoned all of that. And you see him now in this condition, living a very minimalist life because of his love. It's the love of Allah and the love of His Messenger that has drawn him to this path. So Mus'ab ibn Umair is undoubtedly one of the most devout and the most learned of the companions of the Prophet, a man whose sincerity is even attested to by the Prophet. And as we will see in the seerah, he is martyred later on in the battle of Uhud. So Mus'ab ibn Umair, who incidentally, brothers and sisters, was in his mid-20s. So this is not an elderly person. It's a very young person, and the Prophet gives him this very important task. He places a great deal of trust in him. And this is also an important lesson for us, that we have to also empower our youth. We shouldn't baby them and think that, we're going to give all of the important responsibilities to the elders. The Prophet, he mentored young people and he gave them important positions. He made them feel that they were stakeholders in the spread of Islam. After Mus'ab ibn Umair arrives in Medina, he stays with As'ad ibn Zurara, the man who met the Prophet years earlier, who was the first convert to Islam from the people of Yathrib. And Mus'ab ibn Umair and As'ad ibn Zurara, they work very well together. They spread Islam in Yathrib, and they actually establish congregational prayers in Medina, which is not yet called Medina, it's called Yathrib. And Mus'ab ibn Umair becomes the first man in Medina to hold Friday prayers. He was holding Friday prayers, holding Jama'ah prayers. People would gather, they would come to the house of As'ad ibn Zurara, and Mus'ab would basically teach them the Quran. They would have Quran study sessions in Medina. Because of the efforts of these men, slowly many from the Aus and the Khazraj converted to Islam. And because the Prophet saw that there was a growing community in Medina and Yathrib, the Prophet starts to send his companions to Medina. So bear in mind that the Prophet sends many of his companions before he himself emigrates from Mecca to Medina. Now, As'ad's hospitality towards Mus'ab greatly annoyed his cousin Sa'ad ibn Mu'adh. So Sa'ad ibn Mu'adh is the cousin of As'ad. Now I know it's difficult to keep track of the names, but inshallah if you review the notes, the names will become, you'll be more familiar with the names. So Sa'ad ibn Mu'adh becomes irritated. Like, who is this new guy in town? My cousin is always hanging around with him. He's showing him this incredible hospitality. So Sa'ad ibn Mu'adh, who is one of the chiefs of the tribe of Aus, he wants to get to the bottom of this. He wants to break up these meetings. So as one of the chiefs of Aus, Sa'ad ibn Mu'adh, he sends his friend Usayd ibn Hudayr to break up Mus'ab's gatherings. You know, that's what happens. People, when they're in power, if there's anything that's going on in the city that's not under their control, they want to break it up. They want to spoil it. So Sa'ad ibn Mu'adh, he sends Usayd. Usayd goes to this Quran gathering conducted by Mus'ab ibn Umair, and subhanallah, he's captivated by the Quran, and he returns as a converted man. Imagine. So Sa'ad, when he sees that the man that I sent Usayd, my friend Usayd ibn Hudayr, to break up these gatherings, he ends up converting. So Sa'ad says, I want to go see. I want to confront Mus'ab myself. See what's the issue. Why are people flocking to this man? He goes and he meets Mus'ab ibn Umair, and Sa'ad ibn Mu'adh. He too is mesmerized by the Quran. He's transfixed by the beauty and the depth of the Quran, the profound wisdom that pours from the Quran. And soon after, so Sa'ad also converts. Now, Sa'ad, being one of the chiefs of the tribe of Aus, he leverages his position, his authority, and he persuades his entire clan to embrace the new religion. So as you can imagine, there was a snowball effect here. People were joining Islam in droves. Now, in the 13th year after the Bi'thah, 1 year after the First Acaba Pledge, a large group of Muslims from Medina, they come for Hajj. With the rest of the Medinans, the people of Medina, they come for Hajj. Now, so now you have this large Muslim community in Medina. And now they're performing Hajj. Of course, Hajj not based on the rules of Islam, but they were, performing some what was known to them as part of the rites of the Hajj. And many of them are anxious and excited to meet the Prophet. They'd converted to this new religion. Now they have the opportunity to meet the Messenger of God. For many of them, their only experience with Quran was through Mus'ab ibn Umair and some others. So through secret communications, because it was still dangerous to publicize your commitment to the Islamic faith, through secret communications, the group, the Muslim group from Medina, they agreed to meet the Prophet during Ayyam al-Tashriq, during the middle of the month. So on the eve of the 12th of Dhul Hijjah, in a hollow near Jamrat al-Aqaba, and this is in Mina, where we go today to throw pebbles at the Jamarat. In that place, or somewhere near that place, they meet the Prophet. And this meeting happens apparently at nighttime, and they keep the meeting a secret. So not all of the people who were coming from Yathrib were Muslims, so the Muslims kept it a secret from the other pilgrims. And that night, 70 men and 3 women from Yathrib who were Muslims, who had converted, they meet the Prophet. And this becomes known as the Second Acaba Pledge. Now what's interesting here is Abbas, the uncle of the Prophet. Now at this point, Abbas, the Prophet's uncle, had not yet converted to Islam, but he feels a sense of responsibility for the Prophet. He escorts the Prophet to the meeting place, and some narrations say that Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib was also present, and he was keeping a lookout to ensure that Quraysh, they don't ambush them. And Abbas, he addresses the congregation, he addresses the delegation, the pilgrims who had come from Yathrib. And he says, "O people of Khazraj." Now, we know that there were members of the Aus who were also present, but perhaps because the Khazraj were the numerical majority, maybe that's why he addressed them as the people of Khazraj, but Allah knows best. So Abbas, the uncle of the Prophet, before the Prophet speaks, he steps forward and addresses the group, the 73, the 70 plus group from Yathrib. He says to them, O people of Khazraj, Muhammad is dear to us, as you know. We have defended him against our people, against a people to whom he is as dear as he is to us, for he is honored by his people and in his city. But he has chosen to emigrate to you and to join with you. If you believe, you will fulfill the terms with which you have called him to yourselves and defend him against those who oppose him, then so be it. Al-Abbas ibn Abdul Muttalib is essentially, he wants to see, do you guys know what you're getting yourselves into? Don't put the Prophet in harm's way. This is not just, some Joe Schmo off of the street. This is a man who hails from the most noble clan of Quraysh. If you want to commit to the terms, so be it. But if you believe, he says, you will desert him after he emigrates to you, then from this moment let him go. Don't make any false promises, for he is honored among his people and in his city. The people from Yathrib, the Muslims from Yathrib, they say, we have heard what you have said, and they turn to the Prophet and they say, now speak, O Messenger of God, and demand for yourself and for your Lord whatever terms you wish. Look at the commitment of these people. They say, Ya Rasulullah, you tell us what you want from us. We will not dictate to you the terms of our relationship. The Prophet ﷺ, he began by reciting some Quran to them, calling them to God, calling them to Islam. And then he says to them that I call on you to defend me as you defend your women and children. Women and children, the Arabs were very protective of their women and children. The Prophet says, I want you to be as protective of me as you are of them, because I am the messenger of God. I have a mission and I want to deliver this message safely and with your protection. Now, a man by the name of Abu al-Haytham, who was among the listeners, he says to the Prophet, Ya Rasulullah, between us and those men, he's referring to the Jewish tribes, between us and them there are certain ties. We are now severing them. If we do this and God gives you victory over your people, will you return to your people and leave us? So this man says that, we looked up to the Jews. We had relationships with them, ties with them. But we're willing to make you the priority. We are willing to make you our most important point of reference. But we want to know, Ya Rasulullah, if Allah gives you victory over your people, are you going to go back to Mecca? Are you going to leave us? Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa he smiled and he said, no, I will never leave you. Your blood is now my blood. Your sanctity is my sanctity. I and you are one. You and I are one. I shall fight against those who fight you and make peace with those who make peace with you. So the Prophet ﷺ says, no, this is a two-way road. If you are willing to sacrifice for me, if you are willing to be loyal to me, I will be also loyal to you. And then the Prophet ﷺ, he says, send forth 12 men from among yourselves as chiefs, as nuqaba, who will be responsible for their people. The Prophet, he understood the importance of the structures that existed. The Prophet didn't want to dismantle tribal society. Sometimes you have to make da'wah to structures, to institutions, and sometimes that structure is a good thing. So the Prophet, he says that I want you to appoint 12 people who are going to act as chiefs. And they sent forth 12, 9 from Khazraj and 3 from Aus, because the Khazraj were the majority. And As'ad ibn Zurara was chosen as the chief of chiefs. So there is one main leader, one point of contact between the Prophet and these chiefs. And of course, as you know, As'ad ibn Zurara, he was the first one to convert from the people of Yathrib. Now, one of the men from Medina who was at that place during the second Aqaba pledge, and his name was Abbas ibn Ubadah, he said to his people, he says, "O people of Khazraj, do you know what you are pledging this man?" Again, this man seems to be very pious. He wants them to understand that don't think this pledge is just lip service. Do you know what you are pledging to this man? You are pledging to fight white people and black, meaning you're pledging to fight against his enemies no matter who they are. If you think when a scourge afflicts your wealth and kills your loved ones that you will desert him, then leave him now. If you're not willing to go through the fires of tribulation, then don't make any promises. Then leave him. For if you desert him, it will be disgrace in this world and the next. If you abandon the Messenger of God during the times of tribulation, then this would be a great disgrace. And if you believe you will fulfill the terms with which you have called him here, despite loss of wealth and life, then pledge. It is by God the best thing that you can do in this life and the next. So the Muslims from Yathrib, they asked the Prophet, "Ya Rasulullah, if we fulfill this pledge to you, if we commit ourselves to you, what's in it for us?" Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alayhi, he was very honest with them. He says, "Jannah. I'm not going to promise you any worldly power, but I promise you paradise." All of them, resoundingly, they said, "Ya Rasulullah, stretch forth your hand," and they all pledged allegiance to the Prophet. And this became known as Bay'atul Aqaba Thaniya, the second Aqaba pledge. And the summary of the terms of the second Aqaba pledge were as follows. And we saw that from the statement of the Prophet. Number one is to hear and obey the Messenger of God in ease and in hardship, in what we like, in what we dislike, and what we are eager to do. Meaning, obedience to the Prophet ﷺ is unconditional. Number two, and this is important, and this is perhaps one of the reasons why he accepted to go to Yathrib. He got a pledge from them, that the Prophet made them pledge that they would refrain from vying for power with those who rightfully possess it. If you recall, brothers and sisters, when the Prophet was meeting some of the other tribes, for example, when the Prophet was in Ta'if, one of the questions that these tribes would ask, that if Allah gives you victory, are we going to rule after you? Are we going to have a piece of the pie? And the Prophet said, this is in God's hands. But here, the people of Yathrib, they make a pledge to the Prophet that we will not vie for power with those who rightfully possess it. And of course, to speak the truth wherever it may be, and to ignore the taunts of your opponents. The next day after the second Aqaba pledge, Quraysh heard rumors. Someone leaked news that there was a meeting between the Prophet and the people of Yathrib, and many of them had converted to Islam. So Quraysh started to hear these rumors. They apprehended Abdullah ibn Ubay, who was at least temporarily the ruler of the Khazraj. He was, elected as that unifying figure. They questioned him, but he was not aware of anything. They detained Sa'd ibn Ubadah, and they tried to torture him to make him disclose information. And of course, when the people of Yathrib, when the Aus hears that one of our men has been detained by Quraysh, you can only imagine that there was talk about war between Yathrib and between the tribe of Aus and Quraysh. And you can only imagine how catastrophic that would have been. In any case, the Quraysh, when they see that this could escalate and get out of control, they release Sa'ad ibn Ubadah, and the people of Medina, they return to Medina, and this is where you see Islam starts to spread rapidly, especially after the second Aqaba Pledge. Now, some of the important takeaway lessons from the first Aqaba Pledge and the second Aqaba Pledge is, number one, we see from these historical accounts that the people of Yathrib were psychologically primed to accept Islam because the Jews frequently spoke about the advent of the final messenger of God. Now, what's the takeaway lesson for us, brothers and sisters? Similarly, what we can learn from this is that we can also play a role in preparing for the dhuhur of the 12th Imam by educating people about the concept of the divinely chosen Savior at the end of times. So we see how this had an impact. So the Jews would speak about the Prophet of Akhir al-Zaman, and it affected the pagans. And when the pagans were presented the message of the Prophet, now because if you look at it, the Meccans were pagans and the people of Yathrib were pagans. But because the people of Yathrib were exposed to the idea of a final messenger, their hearts were much more, they had a greater capacity to accept. It was not something foreign to them. That's number one. Another lesson that we learn from these pledges and what happens in the years leading up to the Hijrah is that we see how strategic the Prophet was. The Prophet ﷺ doesn't just leave Mecca and head towards Yathrib without first planning. The Prophet plants the seeds for success years before traveling to Yathrib. The Prophet was patient, and this is something that we need to learn. It takes a long time to build a community. We have to be patient, we have to be pragmatic, we have to use diplomacy. So the Prophet here, he teaches us the real meaning of tawakkul. You know, some of us, we are reckless and we think that we are placing our trust in Allah. The Prophet doesn't just leave Mecca without any plan and just hopes that Allah is going to protect him from his enemies. No, the Prophet he's very cautious. He does everything with due diligence. So what we learn from these events leading up to the Hijrah is that the true meaning of tawakkul is that you have to plan, you have to take into consideration all of the contingencies. You have to have contingency plans. You have to make preparations. You have to do your homework. And then, after you've done everything on your end, on your part, after you've done your part, this is when you place your trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So tawakkul means that we have to be rational, we have to prepare, we have to do our homework, and then we place our trust in Allah. Another important lesson that we learn from the events leading up to the Hijrah is that we cannot achieve success alone, my dear brothers and sisters. Even the Prophet recognized that he needed support. And there is no shame in asking for support. Asking for support is not a sign of weakness. You know, sometimes we, as community members, we set ourselves up for failure because we refuse to admit that we need help, that we need support. And this is the mark of a great leader. They recognize that building a community is not an individual effort. You can't do everything. You need a team to help you. You need a team of supporters. You need that network of assistance. So admitting that you need support is not a sign of weakness. The fourth lesson that we learn from these incidents leading up to the Hijrah is that we see that one of the most important prophetic examples is the idea of empowering youth. Unfortunately, in many of our communities, youth are not taken seriously. We don't make them part of the decision-making process. We don't give them important jobs and tasks. We give them the trivial stuff. We don't allow them to join the boards of our masajid because we think that, they're just kids. He's 25, 30 years old, but we trivialize them. We underestimate them. We don't see their full potential. Mus'ab ibn Umair was in his mid-20s. The Prophet could have sent one of his senior companions, but the Prophet, in his mind, age is not a qualification. Yes, sometimes age brings experience, but if you see someone who's young and who's capable, do not dismiss him because of his young age. Mus'ab ibn Umair is in his mid-20s. The Prophet sends him to Yathrib. There was a lot of tribal tension in Yathrib. He basically makes him a conflict, he gives him the job of conflict resolution. He gives him the responsibility of teaching Islam to the people of Yathrib. He gives him the duty of establishing Friday prayer in Yathrib. These are important jobs. So the Prophet ﷺ, he never hesitated to empower youth, to give them important duties if he saw that they were qualified. Number 5, a fifth lesson that we learn is that it's amazing that the Prophet was preaching in Mecca for 13 years, but by and large, the people of Mecca rejected his message. But the people of Yathrib accepted his message. And we mentioned some of the factors that contributed to that. But one of the main reasons why the Meccans refused to surrender to Islam is because Islam did not align with their selfish interests. And this is an important lesson for us, brothers and sisters. If we only follow Islam when it aligns with our interests, then we're no better than those pagans who rejected Islam because Islam jeopardized their selfish interests. So an important lesson that we learn here is that when we only give consideration to our personal interests, we become blind to the truth. And there might be certain Islamic teachings that we reject because it goes against our personal interests. So we need to identify if we're falling into that, because this is precisely what prevented the Meccans from accepting Islam. Number 6 is a sixth lesson that we learn is don't underestimate the power of a small group of committed followers. In our communities, we typically judge the success of our programs by the size of a crowd. If we have a majlis and we fill the majlis with bodies, that means alhamdulillah, this was a successful majlis. We're a successful community if we have X amount of members. Success is not measured by numbers, my dear brothers and sisters. We should not underestimate the power and the influence that even a small number of committed people can have. Mus'ab ibn Umair alone, as we saw, he was able to convert hundreds of people to Islam. He was one person. So this shows us how much potential an individual can have. We think that we need massive institutions to spread Islam. It could be as simple as a devout Muslim who does everything in their capacity, who lives according to the values of Islam, and you can have a profound impact on your community. And finally, my dear brothers and sisters, in the story of the pledges of the Akaba, we learn the virtue of loyalty and gratitude to those who stood with us when we were vulnerable. The Prophet ﷺ was so loyal to the people of Medina, to the Ansar, that he made it his permanent home. As we will see in the seerah of the Prophet, even after the Prophet conquers Mecca, he doesn't stay in Mecca. He doesn't make Mecca his permanent home. Even though Mecca was his birthplace, he goes back to Medina because he wanted to, because this was his token of gratitude to the Ansar for supporting the Prophet ﷺ when his own people had expelled him. So these are some of the practical lessons that we learn from the events that lead up to the Hijrah. Inshallah, in the coming episodes, we'll speak about the Hijrah of the Prophet, and we'll speak a little bit about the political and the religious landscape of the city of Medina, and specifically, why did the Prophet choose the city of Medina to be the destination of his Hijrah. Thank you so much, brothers and sisters, for tuning in to another episode of the life of Prophet Muhammad. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Any questions or comments?
So I'll read this message, this question verbatim. Amazing question today. Never knew these details. Can you please ask Malana if there is a book with this history, or if this is just a collection of different narrations?
This is a collection of many, many different sources, and yeah, unfortunately, we don't have. It would be difficult for me to recommend an English biography of the Prophet that reflects the Shi'i narrative. I think the closest thing that I think Sheikh Subhani has a book on the life of the Prophet called The Message. I believe that's the translation of the title. There's also another book called A Restatement of the History of Islam and Muslims. That's another biography of the Prophet. It also speaks about what transpired after the death of the Prophet, but that's also available online. But beyond that, I don't know of any biography of the Prophet that I would recommend that actually presents the Shi'i narrative of the Seerah. So who knows? Maybe after you guys listen to this lecture series, you'll be inspired to write something. But those two books are really the only ones that come to mind at the moment.
And with the second Akaba Pledge, why was one of the conditions was ignoring the taunts of your opponents, and why is ignoring the taunts such a significant thing here?
Because many of the people of Yathrib, as we mentioned, they were living side by side with Jews. And we know that the Jews rejected the Prophet because he was from the line of Ismail. He was not a descendant of Ishaq. So naturally, those Jews who see the Prophet as a heretic, they're going to mock the Muslims who live in Yathrib. And the Prophet is basically saying that ignore their taunts and ignore their mocking.
Preventing additional conflict.
Exactly, and because the Prophet knows that he's gonna settle in Yathrib in Medina, and he doesn't want to ruffle feathers. That he doesn't want to create additional conflict, as you mentioned. He wants to, because the Prophet has to create a pluralistic society where Muslims and non-Muslims can live side by side peacefully. So if Muslims start hurling back insults at the Jewish community, it's going to make Yathrib a very toxic environment, and the Prophet wants Medina to be a place of peace and mutual respect.
Now, with the civil wars that were happening in Yathrib, were these what form did they take? Were they actual battles in the streets, or what was it like?
Yeah, they were military clashes. In the same way that you saw in the battle of Badr and Uhud, where you have two armies come face to face. That would happen, but you have two tribes, and many of them are related through blood. If you go up their ancestral trees. So yeah, they would fight each other in the same way that war was fought in medieval times. Swords and arrows and spears. and a lot of blood was shed. And the new generation, I mean, these battles were going on for over 100 years. So this new generation, they were just tired of the constant fighting, the constant warfare, and this is why that power vacuum. So because they decided that the only way for there to be peace is if they elect a single leader, and of course, even though temporarily they had appointed Abdullah ibn Ubay ibn Salul, they knew that that was not a long-term solution, because at the end of the day, he is a member of the Khazraj. As impartial as he may present himself, that's the reality. So they were willing to accept the Prophet, because one of the problems in Yathrib is that they did not have a supreme judicial authority. So because the Prophet does not belong to the Aus and the Khazraj, and because he's seen as the messenger of God, and what binds them all together is their faith, they were willing to accept the Prophet as their leader, because that void existed, and the Prophet was not biased towards the Aus and the Khazraj, and they were open to having him rule and bring peace and stability to Yathrib. Because at the end of the day, people want to live, they want to have children, they want to have peaceful lives, and they saw the Prophet as the only man who could actually establish peace in Yathrib. And as we'll see as the story continues, Abdullah ibn Ubay, he becomes Muslim, but he harbors this animosity towards the Prophet, because you basically took kingship away from me. Like, he was the man, he was the head honcho, as they say, in Yathrib, and all of a sudden the Prophet arrives and he's not an important person anymore. He's just another average Muslim. So that animosity festers in his heart, and he becomes one of the leaders of the munafiqeen. So then you see the phenomenon of hypocrisy. Of course, it existed in Mecca to a certain degree, but you see how the hypocrites begin organizing themselves, and they try to sabotage the mission of the Prophet. But inshallah, we'll get to that in due time.
From what I understand, the Imams all preferred to live in Medina whenever that was possible.
Yeah.
Was that perhaps a continuation of this loyalty or this pledge the Prophet made to make that his home?
I mean, the thing is, unfortunately, what we saw after the death of the Prophet, we saw that pledge was not really fulfilled, because if they truly fulfilled that pledge, they would have supported Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib. The majority of them did not. So it seems that the reason why the Imams of Ahlul Bayt chose Medina to be their place of residence is because of proximity to the holy grave of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And in addition to that, the Imams of Ahlul Bayt were quite adamant about living with non-Shi'as. The Imams never wanted to surround themselves by their followers. The Imams never said to their followers, let us go to this distant land and let's create, a Shi'i kingdom. The Imams, alayhimus salam, they are the Imams for the entire Ummah. And how else are people... And by the way, Medina was not a city that was heavily populated with Shi'a. So there were many non-Shi'as who were living in Medina, and the Imams saw this as an important strategy of da'wah, of inviting people to the truth. How are people going to be introduced to the pure Islam of Ahlul Bayt if the Imams decide to surround themselves with like-minded people? The only way that people are going to be introduced to the Islam of Ahlul Bayt is if the Imams make it a point to live in areas that are predominantly non-Shia. But so there are there may be more than one reason, but definitely to be in close proximity to the Prophet and their honorable grandmother Fatima al-Zahra alayhi salam, and of course the opportunities for da'wah in Medina.
Thank you. And why did the Prophet first try migrating to these other cities if he had this power base that was building in Yathrib already?
Again, as we saw, the power, like there were in the 13th year after the Bi'tha. This is when you see a growing number of people in Medina. The blockade ended in the 10th year after the Bi'tha. Abu Talib dies in the 10th year after the Bi'tha. So immediately after the death of Abu Talib, it wasn't clear at that time that the Prophet was going to go to Medina. He was exploring the options that were available to him.
Assalamu alaikum, Sheikh.
Alaykum assalam wa rahmatullah.
Today's session was very, very informative, mashallah. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give you more tawfiq and more iman and
Inshallah, with your dua.
ta'ala support you in all your endeavors. Sheikh, a passion crossed my mind that when Imam Ali alayhi salam was elected the fourth Khalifa of Muslims, so why did he leave Medina and made his capital Kufa?
Yeah. As you know, after the death of the Prophet, the Islamic empire was expanding rapidly. And it was expanding rapidly because of military expeditions. The Muslims were conquering new territories, and the Islamic empire was growing very rapidly, especially during the reign of Umar ibn al-Khattab. Now, in the 16th year, I believe, after the Hijrah, the city of Kufa was officially founded, and it was a garrison town. So as the Islamic empire is expanding, Kufa geographically becomes central. It becomes really the center of the Islamic empire. Logistically, it's connected to many parts of the Islamic empire. The Muslim army, it was a garrison town. There were a lot of fighters who lived in Kufa. So Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen, he moved for logistical reasons. It was just more central for his government. The Imam alayhi salam knew that he would probably have to deal with Muawiyah, so he needed military strength. And because many military veterans lived in Kufa, the Imam alayhi salam felt that it would be appropriate if he established his government near a military, the strongest military base. We also know that the Imam alayhi salam had many devout Shi'as who lived in Kufa. So Kufa was a Shi'i stronghold. So all of these factors contributed to the Imam's decision to relocate the capital of the government from Medina to Kufa. And it was also a place where you have different tribes. So it was a very metropolitan area. It was an area that had many supporters of the Imam, political supporters of the Imam, the military base. Geographically, it was ideal because it wasn't too far removed from other cities like the city of Medina. So because of its central location, among the other reasons that I mentioned, the Imam decided to move it there.
Thank you, Sheikh.
Ahsantum,
Another
jazakum.
question crossed my mind.
Yes.
Was that the same reason why Imam Hussein alayhi salam migrated, left Medina and went to Kufa?
Yes. The Imam alayhi salam, the Imam, he's trying to fight. I mean, the Imam alayhi salam was conducting a revolution, and many of the Imams, so many of the Shi'as who were devoted followers of his father, were in Kufa. You have people like Habib ibn Madahir, who was a companion of Amir al-Mu'mineen. So the Imam alayhi salam was trying to recruit support from the people of Medina. So, and of course, if you're gonna rise up, you also need that support, and the most loyal support was in Kufa. And I think, unfortunately, the people of Kufa have been unfairly given a bad reputation. People typically say, "Oh, the people of Kufa are this and that." Yes, there were people in Kufa who betrayed the Imam, but we cannot forget about the 10,000 who were imprisoned and executed by the Umayyads. So there were many pious people that the Imams relied upon in Kufa. People like Maytham al-Tammar is in Kufa. You know, people like Hani ibn Urwa, all of these great personalities were in Kufa. So the Imams had great support in the city of Kufa. Kufa was considered to be a Shia stronghold.
Thank you, Sheikh.
Ahsantum.